From amassing a £200 million fortune as one of Britain's most feared gangsters to living in a council house in London, this is the astonishing true gangster story of Terry Adams. In 2018, at 64 years old, Terry Adams was sent to jail for 12 months for his criminal activities. Described by police as being worse than the Krays twins in his heyday, Adams ruled London's underworld with an iron fist for almost 5 decades. He controlled a significant portion of the drug trade and presided over an estimated 25 murders and numerous horrifically violent attacks. His mafia-style empire was once valued at up to £200 million, with his reign starting from the 1970s well into the early 2000s. Times did change, though. Adams was finally sent to prison in 2007 for money laundering. He was freed in 2010, while his leading henchmen accumulated a string of convictions. 3 of his brothers, Patrick, Michael and Thomas, known as Patsy, Mickey and Tommy, were behind bars at the time. Terry Adams himself came close to joining them for a long prison stint. However, in true Terry Adams style, he found a way to keep his freedom once again. Despite all that, Adams, who was once recorded discussing a knife attack that would open up a rival like a bag of crisps, maintained all the trappings of success. Dining at top restaurants, wearing bespoke suits, and traveling in a fleet of luxury cars. But it is scandalous to report that his decorated lifestyle was being subsidized by taxpayers. This became public knowledge as a result of a court hearing in which Adams revealed that his home, where he had been living for 18 months, was owned by the Labour-run borough of Camden. How this gangland boss, with his reputation for breaking bodies and slashing faces, came to occupy one of Britain's most sought-after council houses for a rent believed to be £160 a week is unclear. After all, Camden Council had announced that anyone with assets worth more than £32,000 would be removed from the council house waiting list for one of its homes. So whether corruption, incompetence, or something less murky was to blame remains uncertain. What is known, however, is that Adams, a fitness fanatic who reputedly did 2,000 press-ups a day during his various stints behind bars, is a very hard man to say no to. His home before the council house was situated in the middle of Bloomsbury, surrounded by boutiques, wine bars and world-famous cultural institutions. A handsome Victorian terrace that London real estate agents called a truly outstanding place to live. Houses on this sought-after street, a crown jewel of the local conservation area, were valued at between £2 million and £3 million. Flats started at £650,000 for a single-bedroom home. Here, among the assorted local bankers, lawyers and captains of industry, lived the dapper Terry Adams. Married to Ruth, 58, an actress whose CV included bit parts in EastEnders, 999, and, perhaps ironically, The Bill. He was a colourful addition to the community, for Terry Adams was the notorious boss of Britain's most feared modern crime family. Terry, the eldest of 11 children born to a Northern Irish Catholic lorry driver and raised in a then-deprived corner of Islington, began his career extorting money in the playground. After leaving school at 15 in 1969, he graduated first to running protection rackets involving market stallholders, then to armed robberies. In the 70s, his family syndicate, known as the A-Team, diversified into the more lucrative drug trade, building links to Colombian cartels and creating a network of dealers to distribute cannabis and cocaine, and later ecstasy. Terry Adams ran it like a business, chairing corporate-style board meetings. His brothers tended to be the ruthless enforcers who got their hands dirty. With the spoils, Adams bought a large home for £1 million in cash and filled it with antiques and artworks, including Henry Moore prints and Picasso etchings. Above the fireplace was a life-size poster of Al Pacino in his role as Tony Montana from the mafia movie Scarface. Adams also owned a holiday villa in Cyprus, along with a yacht, and paid for his daughter Sky to be privately educated at the Sylvia Young Theatre School. This life of luxury was, of course, fueled by sickening violence. The Adams Syndicate turned killing into an art form, importing the mafia assassination technique of using gunmen riding pillion on motorbikes. In the 80s, a rival Irish crime family, the Rileys, found this out to their cost. First, Patsy Adams walked into a pub with a companion who insulted George Riley in front of his wife. After Riley raced home to get a gun and returned in a BMW with several brothers, he was ambushed by a group of Adams's henchmen who peppered the car with shotguns and pistols. While no one died, the Rileys realized they'd been outgunned and never bothered the Adams clan again. For Terry Adams, the violence came easily. Somewhat harder was the business of laundering the vast sums his criminal enterprises generated. In 1995, the Inland Revenue realized that, despite his prosperous lifestyle, he'd never paid a penny in income tax. A Hatton Garden jeweler called Solly Nahome, who helped the gang hide its proceeds, created a set of false accounts showing that Terry worked as a jewelry designer. Though the case was settled via the payment of £95,000, the authorities were suspicious. Then, 3 years later, Nahome was assassinated on his doorstep, apparently by a rival gang, and the laundering machine he created began to crumble. Police had by then been monitoring Adams's home, placing listening bugs in his sitting room and bedroom. The spy system produced evidence of substantial criminality. At one point, for example, they heard Terry talking with a friend called Dan about a beating he'd personally administered. "When I hit someone with something, I do them damage," he said. "I went to the geezer and I went crack. On my baby's life, his kneecap came right out there, all white, all bone." On another occasion, Adams was recorded ordering retribution on a girl called Alicia. "She's got to be done. She's got to have acid flung in her face." Then there were examples of extraordinary spending: £45,000 in cash on a Mercedes sports car for his daughter Sky, tens of thousands more on first-class flights, all from a man with no obvious source of legal income. When police raided his home, they found antiques worth £500,000, jewelry worth £48,000, and £59,000 in cash in a shoebox in the attic. It took years for the subsequent case to reach court, mainly due to cynical delaying tactics by Adams, who repeatedly sacked his defense teams and at one point claimed his IQ was too low to understand the charges. But in 2007, he agreed to plead guilty to a specimen money laundering charge and was jailed until 2010. Crucially, the conviction meant he became the subject of a financial reporting order, often applied to career criminals, requiring him to disclose sources of all cash and possessions worth more than £500. Inevitably, it saw him bogged down in litigation ever since. In 2012, Adams was sent back to prison after it emerged that he'd failed to declare luxury purchases, including a £7,500 facelift, membership of an exclusive Hertfordshire country club, and £2,200 on a Cartier watch. On his release, he was ordered to repay £750,000 under a confiscation order related to his prior conviction. Adams responded by pleading poverty, saying he was a broken man forced to survive by pouncing off his wife and couldn't possibly find that cash. Prosecutors reckoned otherwise, however, telling the court that he'd recently enjoyed, among other things, massages at the Dorchester Hotel, expensive meals at Brown's in Mayfair, and a string of first-class flights. At the time, in 2014, Adams told the court he was living in an apartment near St Albans in Hertfordshire. Quite how, 2 years later, he was able to convince Camden Council's housing department that he'd lived in their borough for 5 of the previous 7 years is anyone's guess. The confiscation case rumbled on until 2017, when a judge ruled that Terry Adams actually had substantial means and would be sent to prison for several years unless the cash was produced within a few days. Remarkably, the broken man managed to find £730,000 in less than 24 hours. History repeated itself. Adams was told to pay £50,000 in prosecution costs owed to the Crown, but again pleaded extreme poverty. His barrister, Stephen Gilchrist, said, "He hasn't got the money." This second case continued until the judge lost patience and announced that Adams would be sent to prison immediately if he refused to pay. Once again, the broken man managed to come up with the cash in around 24 hours. He therefore remained a free man. Meanwhile, Camden Council, responsible for some areas that are in the 10% most deprived in the country, and which supposedly doesn't give properties to people with more than £32,000, found itself in an awkward position. For it had rented one of its smartest council flats to a notorious violent criminal who had, during the 18 months he'd lived there, been able to lay his hands on 25 times that amount. How appalled local council taxpayers would be to know that they were footing the bill. Terry Adams owed his status to a remarkable ability to play the system, whether applying for council housing or trying to stay out of jail. Time and again, he'd used corrupt public officials to frustrate investigations. In 1999, to cite one example, a Crown Prosecution Service clerk called Mark Herbert was jailed for conspiring to pass details of 33 secret police informants to the gang. Other times, when Adams and his cohorts faced prosecution, they generally escaped unscathed. A string of trials had, over the years, either collapsed amid rumors of witness intimidation or ended in acquittals. Perhaps the most famous involved David Mackenzie, a Mayfair financier who laundered drug money for the Adams family but lost around £1.5 million in the late 1990s after a string of poor investments. The Old Bailey subsequently heard how he was summoned to Terry Adams's home in North London and told to pay the money back. Everyone stood up when he walked in, Mackenzie said, referring to the gang boss's entrance. He looked like a star, a cross between Liberace and Peter Stringfellow. He was immaculately dressed in a long black coat and white frilly shirt. He was totally in command. Unfortunately for Mackenzie, the cash was not instantly forthcoming. A few days later, he was savagely beaten by an Adams associate named Christopher McCormack. In an attack lasting 20 minutes, the financier was kicked and beaten, suffering 3 broken ribs before being slashed around the wrists and face with a Stanley knife. By the time the punishment and beating ended, his ears and nose were nearly severed, held on by slivers of skin, while 2 tendons in his hands had been permanently damaged. When the case reached court, DNA samples showed that Mackenzie's blood was spattered on McCormack's motorbike jacket. The defendant maintained that it must have come from an earlier incident when he'd broken up a fight between Mackenzie and another man. The jury agreed. As the verdict was read out, McCormack said thank you to them, adding, "Come and have a drink over the pub." One elderly male juror waved at him. Among the many other controversial cases, in 1985, Tommy Adams was acquitted of helping launder the proceeds from the £26 million Brinksmat bullion robbery, while brother Patsy was cleared in the 1990s of importing 3 tons of cannabis worth £25 million. Not long afterward, when Patsy was arrested for a further drugs offence, officers found a gun and a complete set of bulletproof body armour. But Patsy claimed they belonged to his wife. The jury believed that too. Throughout this time, the Adams family was protected by the Code of Omerta, by which career criminals refused to cooperate with police investigations. In 1991, for example, East End thug Mad Frankie Fraser was shot in the head outside a Clerkenwell nightclub and nearly killed. The perpetrator was widely believed to be Patsy Adams. But when Fraser recovered and was asked who did it, by detectives he replied, "Tutankhamun." By then, Terry Adams had been a fixture of London's gangland for 20 years. Wensley Clarkson, author of a book on Britain's gangs, said, "The Adamses are probably the last of the old-school British crime families. They're a bit like the Sopranos. They made their money and then sent their children to private schools, bought art, invested in legal businesses. Terry, in particular, is very bright. In another era, another world, he could have been head of a major international corporation, and that's how these people see themselves, in a way." But while Terry Adams continued to live a life of relative luxury, it was scandalous to report that his lifestyle was being subsidized by taxpayers. Camden Council refused to comment, insisting that its housing system prioritizes people in accordance with legislation. So whether corruption, incompetence, or something less murky was to blame remained uncertain. Despite his attempts to evade justice and maintain a luxurious lifestyle at the expense of taxpayers, Terry Adams' story serves as a stark reminder of the depths of corruption and the challenges law enforcement faces when dealing with organized crime. His ability to manipulate the system highlights flaws that allow such individuals to slip through the cracks. As we reflect on the life and crimes of one of Britain's most notorious gangsters, it's clear that the fight against such entrenched criminal empires is far from over. The question remains, how many more are exploiting the system right under our noses? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the true gangster story of Terry Adams. If you found this exploration informative, please share it to raise awareness. Together, we can shine a light on corruption and advocate for change.